My name's Alex Dubois, so I am the Curator of Collections here, and the staff here has been working for 4 years at this point on this project, so we're really thrilled to have you here today and sort of give you an update about what we're working on. So we've focused this on our current research, so you'll hear some of the stuff that we've just discovered, which is exciting. I'm going to do my best to talk really loud and fairly slow. If I get soft or fast, please just let me know and I will adjust accordingly. But I just want to thank you again, all of you, for coming out. I want to thank the Women's Forum for inviting us to talk and giving us this opportunity to share the Connecticut stories from the Western Reserve. So as a way to start, and I probably have asked this at many events in the past when we talk about the reserve, I just want to know by show of hands how many attendees today know a little bit about the Western Reserve. Great. Out of curiosity, how many of you heard about the Western Reserve at one of our past events? Great, so we're doing our job. That's wonderful to know. So we are going to start today with a little bit of a reintroduction just for those who aren't familiar with the Western Reserve or just sort of want to refamiliarize themselves. But most of what we're going to do is meet some people who are out in Ohio doing the work of settling the reserve or living in the reserve. And these are all accounts that we recently came across or found in repositories. So, like I said, we started this in 2018, 2019. We knew that Connecticut had a connection to Ohio in this place called the Western Reserve. And we knew that people came to us to use our institutional collection to learn more about that story. So we thought there's got to be some good information there that could probably be a really good exhibition. So we've gotten, I think we've received 2 grants from Connecticut Humanities, a planning grant and an implementation grant. So we've had a really great amount of funding to do a lot of interesting stuff with this story. And as was mentioned, our exhibit is opening finally in April 21st, 2023. We'll have a 2-year exhibition in our other gallery that's all about the story. But we recently, I think it was in November, we actually took our own little migration to the Western Reserve to do a research trip. We spent 5 days visiting repositories, mostly in Cleveland and the surrounding area, to look at some of the documents that we knew existed, but we just didn't have access to. The thing about the reserve story is the letters that we have here are all letters that came from Ohio, and then the letters that they have are all the letters that came from Connecticut, more or less, and also ones that were sent within Ohio. So to get the other side of the story, we really needed to go to Ohio, and that's what we did. So in the most basic sense, the Western Reserve is a small area in northeastern Ohio that was owned for a very short time by Connecticut. That's the sort of general idea. It all dates back to 1662, and really an imperfect understanding of how big North America was. So the Royal Charter that was written for the colony of Connecticut extended its boundaries using words, not a map or any actual sense of distance, and described it as describe the border, the bottom of the passage here from the charter. It describes the western border as the South Sea. This is a body of water that we now know as the Pacific Ocean. So in theory, Connecticut, if you read this, stretched all the way from where it connected with Rhode Island to the Pacific Ocean. And that's really what Connecticut had to claim. And you can see that this is a defining aspect of a lot of colonial charters, is ambiguity about where those borders are. But if you imagine what became of that, is that Connecticut, looking at its charter, asserted its rights to land that extended all the way to the Pacific Ocean. So if you take the northern and southern boundary lines of Connecticut and you extend them all the way west, you can get a sense of how much land Connecticut could claim using that charter. You can see on this map, which is one of our favorite documents we have, that they sort of skipped over Pennsylvania and New York. There's a whole nother history we can't get into today about sort of conflicts and challenges that occurred in that area. But what we're talking about is actually sort of right to the south of Lake Erie is where we're going to be situated. So following the revolution, 7 states, you can see some of them on this map, all had similar land claims going west. And what happened is they started ceding that land back to the federal government. Connecticut did this in 1786, but what it kept was a 120-mile long segment in northeastern Ohio that it reserved for its own use. And that's where the name, the Connecticut Western Reserve, came from. So Connecticut keeps this land for about 9 years and does very little with it. And then they decide they're just going to sell it. So they take all the land that they've claimed and they sell it to a group of private investors for $1.2 million, which in that time period was quite a significant sum of money. And this happens in 1795. So a group of investors, wealthy men from Connecticut and some of them from Massachusetts, get together and they purchase the whole of the Western Reserve. The money from that sale, and to my knowledge, this is still something that's in existence, was set aside for public school funding in Connecticut. It was called the Connecticut School Fund. So the people who sold the state, when they sold the land, was thinking forward about how they could still benefit from what they had claimed. So 1795, it turns over to private hands, so it's no longer state property. And only for about a period of 5 years is this sort of no man's land where there isn't really jurisdiction by any state or government authority. It's sort of just land that is owned by individuals. And then in 1800, partially due to some difficulties with settling this land and understanding who owns it and who gets to govern it, the land is sort of given back to the federal government. And then in 1803, it becomes the state of Ohio. So the actual existence of the Western Reserve as an entity is very short. It's only a number of a few years. When we refer to the reserve, we're looking at sort of the long history of the geographical identity. So even after Ohio statehood, we're still going to call it the Western Reserve because it did maintain something of that New England characteristic, its own sort of geographical identity. And of course, even after it becomes a state, all the land that's still in private hands is still in private hands, and all those sales and settlement patterns are still going on. So in the reserve, as in all places moving west and in pretty much the whole country, new settlement came at the expense of native populations. So Ohio was home to several native nations. Some of them were native to Ohio or were considered native to Ohio. Other tribes had been moved there due to earlier conflicts, so earlier relocation. But we need to remember that some of the native people that are being moved out of Ohio in the process of settling it are ones that have already been forced to relocate from other homes. On the left, and this is just abbreviated, these are the big ones, are some of the treaties that were signed with native tribes, some of them from Ohio, Michigan, and other areas in the time period that we're talking about. Most of these treaties followed conflict. So usually there was a conflict, an armed conflict, a battle, a war in the case of the 1786 to 1795. And then as a result of which there was a treaty in which representatives of native nations ceded land to the federal government or to another entity. Oftentimes the tribes rejected these treaties because they held that the people who signed them didn't have the standing to do so. So they had no right to give away this land. And also, as these treaties were signed and the other party, be it the government, federal government, the state government, or individual landholders, as they began to alter or fail to live up to those promises, they would again reject the treaties. And we also need to understand that treaty obligations did not end encroachment. So even after land was ceded and land was kept, Western expansion continued pretty nonstop. And then the other thing that we like to remind people, because we sometimes fall into the habit of referring to the reserve as Ohio. The reserve is a pretty small northeastern section of Ohio. So number 4 on that map is what we're actually talking about. But you can see that what is modern Ohio today, the whole state was being cut up, divided, and settled by different groups. The first one is actually down here, number 13, which included the city of Marietta. That's where the first sort of settlement into Ohio occurs, and then the Western Reserve comes later. And in each case, there are other native populations that are being moved out or forced to relocate as this is going on. And the other thing that's worth noting is that white line that you see that passes straight through the reserve. That's the sort of the boundary line that was set up in the 1795 Treaty of Greenville. So this is after that treaty was signed. Everything northwest of that line was still legally the property of native populations in Ohio. But you can see that the people who are coming in obviously already have plans to continue settlement, even if they don't have the legal right to do so. So some of the lands that are being settled and sold, moving west in the reserve, are being sold a couple decades before they had the legal right to actually own that land. So that's just another aspect of the story that we want to make sure we bring into our exhibition and our project. So if you were someone who bought millions of acres of land that was about 400 to 500 miles away from where you're living, the first thing you want to probably understand is, what did you buy? So the first people that actually go into Ohio, the first white people who are coming are actually surveyors and teams of people who are trying to divide up the land and understand what they bought and who owns what piece of land. So the surveyors generally they start on this map, and we'll show it. They start in the southeast corner of the Western Reserve, and they work up and then they work over. So you can see they started in this map. You can see how they started to divide the land up, moving west into the reserve. So the surveying parties went out in 1796 and 1797, and each one had a number of people who were surveyors, so trained surveyors. But they also had laborers who did things like cut down trees. They were called axemen. People who tended animals. They had one physician, which is a terrifying concept for a group of 40 people spread out this far to have one doctor on hand. They had someone who was, they called them the bargeman or the boatman, who actually was moving supplies around. And then they had someone who was making sure that everyone got fed, not always successfully. And the surveyors themselves relied on a combination of techniques and skills. So they used a surveying chain, is the one everyone might be familiar with, is the principal tool. They also used compasses. They used astronomy, so they looked at star patterns to figure out where they were and how far they were gone. They used trigonometry and pretty advanced mathematics to figure out if they were actually marking these in the right place. And all of this did require the surveyors to be pretty well-trained, organized individuals. They were not always accurate, so we do see quite often that a surveyor has to go back out to a township because they've measured it incorrectly, or someone has messed up and goofed, and they get to points where they've sort of run out of townships and there's extra land that's left over. So it's not an exact science. But what they're also doing is on the corners of these townships, they're doing things like blazing trees, placing markers, or just trying to physically create some sense of order on the land here. So Walt Woodward, who is our state historian, or was our state historian, who's written about this subject, he describes the importance of surveying as laying out distant and unknown lands into packages of the same size and shape, turned in a regular and unknown landscape into a standardized commodity that could be bought and sold at standardized prices. So he's really just encapsulating what this whole idea is. Take the unknown, turn it into something they could understand, and then that way they could sell it. So the first person we're going to meet from our trip to Ohio is a man named Seth Pease. So that name might be familiar to some people here. So Seth Pease was a surveyor. He was a cartographer. He was born in Connecticut. I've seen something say that he studied at Yale, but there's no actual evidence he attended Yale. But we do know at some point, either through self-teaching or studying with a known surveyor, he get pretty good at mathematics and understanding how this works. He goes out in 1796 as a junior surveyor, so just one of the surveyors working on the team. And he goes out in 1797 as the principal surveyor. So he does quite a good job. He also produces the earliest map of the town of Cleveland. So Cleveland is named after General Moses Cleveland, who was one of the representatives who went on the trip. And then he produces the first printed map of the Western Reserve, was thanks to Seth Pease. That's the one that you're looking at here. So as part of the duties of the surveyors, most of them, because they were educated and literate, they kept journals and diaries. And these describe both what they were doing as surveyors, so their official duties, and also just their life on the reserve. So how they found the land, how they lived. These are really the best description we have of the land pre-formal settlement. So how it would have been found by the people who got there. Multiple of these journals, fortunately, have been identified, transcribed, and published, and you can find them online. So if you want to read more, I'm happy to send those your way. Unfortunately, Seth Pease's journal is not the greatest. It's actually pretty boring. So what I've done here is turn to my favorite journal, my favorite surveyor. His name is Moses Warren. So he was also on the surveying teams in 96 and 97. And he writes the most colorful, most honest, most descriptive versions of what's happening in Ohio. So I pulled a couple of my favorite quotes and put them up here. So the one on the left talks about his opinion about the mosquitoes that he found in the Western Reserve. And he used, again, quite colorful language, talking about his ancient namesake and how they should have plagued the pharaoh with mosquitoes instead of frogs. The one up top is a pretty interesting one. So they went hunting, so they made a pot pie out of woodchuck. We know that they also made a pot pie out of raccoon and a few other animals. It seemed to be a favorite way to cook and eat these animals. But also I love that the people on the team had neglected to dig a necessary, which would be a latrine for them to use. And he came back to the camp and said, this is pretty important, and made sure it got done. But then the other thing about these is, these are a group of individuals who are out in an unpopulated area, unpopulated by native people, but unpopulated by white migrants as of yet. And they are often on their own. And if they have an emergency or a medical illness, there's only one doctor and there's only so much that they can do. So there are deaths by illness, there are deaths by accidents, there are deaths when boats overturn or people get injured in doing this work. And here you can see, he says that there are a couple of people who have died. And even in Cleveland, most of the team has been sick. And they call it the ague or the fever. It could have been malaria or any number of diseases that would cause them to be feverish. And some of them didn't make it through. So you do get a sense, if you read these all the way through, of just how difficult this work was. But the reason they did it was pretty well paid, and we'll talk about that. So this is actually Seth Pease's account book. So the one thing I did love finding at this repository was that they had more than just the journals. They had his financial papers, they had his correspondence. So we got a much better sense of the broad scope of what they were doing. So this is his account from 1796 with the Connecticut Land Company, who had bought the land. And it really allows us to do a few things that we couldn't do just in the journal. So we can trace his route from Connecticut to Ohio and back. So a lot of them started their journals in Ohio. The finances go back to Connecticut because they had to pay to get there. So we can really see exactly the route they're taking. We can see what they're purchasing, both in terms of provisions and also, in the case of surveyors, the specific instruments they need to do their job. We can also see things like where they're lodging, how often they're washing because they paid for washing. And we found in a lot of them, the term entertainment comes up as an expense. They don't really elaborate. They just say, a certain amount of money for entertainment at someone's lodge. We also understand how much they were paid. So Seth Pease in 1796 was paid $2.50 per day. He worked for 187 days, and that totaled over $460. In 1797, he got a raise because he was the principal surveyor to $3.50 per day, $3.50, and he made over $1,000. But he also worked almost a full year. So the 1797 journey was a full year, including winter. The general rate paid to axemen and other people in the party was $12 per month, so significantly less than the surveyor made. So interesting on here is on the left, there's a cool line about for one pair of boots for General Cleveland. So General Cleveland needed a specific pair of boots that he accounted for. And then on the right, you can see he's paying cash for mathematical instruments. So because he's a surveyor, he needs certain tools and he has to procure them himself. And then here, just to give you a sense of what else he's buying. So you can see there's Peas, which he spelled like his last name rather than the correct spelling. Peppermint, you can see just how much, 372 pounds of flour, and that was just at one location. That wasn't for the whole expedition. Pork, thread, other things he needs. You also see cider and rum a lot, so they were definitely purchasing and moving alcohol. It's one of the most common things, actually. Beef, and then some of the small things he'll need, like a Gunter scale, another instrument. And this gives you a sense of what this group of men are needing on their journey and purchasing along the way. And then I also was really excited to find sort of letters from before the 1797 expedition in which they are forming the surveying party. So we had a list of all the names of the people who went out. We knew who some of them were, but this really gives us a sense to see how they would form this group, why people would want to go out, and how much they were paid, and also what kind of skills were valuable to the surveying party. So this one on the left, this is a letter of introduction. This is a letter from someone who wants to go on the journey. They were generally either someone who was known to Pease writing saying, please allow so-and-so to go on this journey with you, he needs the money, or someone saying, please allow me to go on the journey, I need the money. But the man on the left is writing and saying that he can work as a physician. And he actually becomes the one doctor that goes on this trip, is that man, Theodore Shepard. This one is actually quite a powerful quote. This is Moses Warren, who we heard from. He was one of the surveyors writing the Pease, recommending a few people, one of them being a gentleman who has had the misfortune to lose his wife and children except one, and is now determined to make his future residence in the Western country. So that's a good example of one reason why someone would want to go out to Ohio. Someone who's lived in Connecticut, who's lost their family, who sees opportunity, whether that's economic or just for a fresh start out in Ohio. And I think this is one of the best letters that we found. Then it's just some interesting things. So like where would Moses Warren and Seth Pease get their instruments from? And we found a letter from someone who made specifically surveying instruments that he would have enclosed with the two compasses that Seth Pease bought, saying that he hopes he liked it. They may need to be adjusted. And there was also some bartering going on. So Seth Pease didn't want to pay full price. And he wrote saying, I've spent a lot of time. You can see I've taken almost infinite pains to make this instrument good. So he doesn't want to give him a discount. So Seth Pease does both parties. His success in Ohio really leads to his career as a surveyor. So he actually does surveys in Maine and New York. He's often working for the same clients that were part of the Connecticut Land Company. So they know he's good and they're hiring him for future investments. He was named the U.S. Surveyor General for the Mississippi and Orleans Territory. And he actually later became Assistant Postmaster General during the Jefferson administration. So Pease sort of takes this and turns it into quite a successful career. Related to this, so once you've collected all this information, the surveyors have their diaries, their journals, their reports, all their drawings, all their measurements. The next thing that makes sense is to take all of that and to make it into a map. So we're going to meet a gentleman, Amos Doolittle, who is another name that people might be familiar with, who took the drawings that Pease was giving him and turned it into the first map of the Western Reserve. The most accessible way, and we found this even just trying to communicate about the reserve, to talk about this area is really to look at a map, to see what's going on, where things are located. So these were among the first documents we looked at. The first map I looked at was Seth Pease's map of the Western Reserve, printed by Amos Doolittle. And while we were in Ohio, we actually found Amos Doolittle's papers, which was quite exciting for me as just a museum curator to see where something came from. But Amos Doolittle is probably best known for these 4 engravings of the battles of Lexington and Concord. So Doolittle was, again, born in Connecticut. He joined the governor's foot guard, actually serving under General Arnold, Benedict Arnold. And after the battles of Lexington and Concord, his unit went to Massachusetts to help in the siege of Boston. At some point in time, for some reason, Doolittle gets permission to leave the company and go to Lexington and Concord. And while he's there, he asks participants in the battles and also eyewitnesses just about what had happened. And he creates one of the most accurate accounts, visual accounts of these battles. Going along with him was a gentleman named Ralph Earl, who, if you've been to our museum at all, or you've heard me talk about portraits, you'll know that we have 7 or 8 portraits by Ralph Earl up in the top gallery. So Ralph Earl's a young artist at the time. He's not a patriot, he's actually a loyalist, but he's accompanying Doolittle. And what he does is he takes the information Doolittle is getting, he draws preliminary sketches, and then from that Doolittle makes the engravings. So it's another small connection to Litchfield and one of our people here. But here's one of the letters from Doolittle writing to Seth Pease. This is actually when Doolittle decides to accept the commission to make these maps. He references an earlier map he had done in terms of pricing. That's the map of Vermont that you see here. And just, again, saying, if you are happy with what I've done, I'll be happy to do this, giving him a general idea of how much it might cost for this project. And then a later map is actually the first time he's enclosing finished maps of the Western Reserve. So you can see he sends 24 of the maps. And the thing that I love to see at the bottom was he's now printing the maps, and he's going to have 500 ready for delivery next week. 500, yeah, when I read it, seemed like a big amount of maps, considering the Connecticut Land Company probably only needed 30 to 40 for their own members. But what I think this gets at is that Seth Pease understood that once people knew about the reserve, they'd want to invest, they'd want to go out there, they'd want to know more. So he needed the map as the best way to sort of communicate that information. There's actually one more letter that's from Boardman to Pease that's related to this. And in that letter, Elijah Boardman, who's another one of our individuals who lived in New Milford, had business connections here in town. He writes Pease and asks for 4 or 5 maps to be sent, because he's going to the reserve and he needs to know where he's going and he needs to know where his land is. So we can, get a sense of exactly how important this map was to the early settlers, early investors going out into the reserve. And here's the map. So this is the full map. You've seen a cropped version of it, but this is the full map. And it really does give you a good sense of how they surveyed. So again, going from south to north and from east to west, they divided it into ranges, which go up and down, and then townships were numbered starting with 1 at the bottom. And you can see even by this time, when this map is done in 1804, some of the towns are already named and some of the towns have already started being broken up into lots so that people know where their specific lots are. You can see that in that row right there. But it also tells us in that middle, it says unsurveyed lands still subject to Indian claim. So this is, again, that line dividing the reserve. This is the land that has not been ceded yet. And then at the far end, if you can see it, there's something called the fireland. The firelands were a section of the reserve that were held to be given to people in Connecticut who had lost land or suffered damage during the Revolution. So when the British raided Connecticut, as sort of a way to give back to those people, they reserved land that was to be given to them in the fire land. What we do know is that very few people from Connecticut actually got that land and moved out to Ohio. What happened was they often sold that land to other investors who then resold it. But that's that far end over there. And then this is the sort of the most important, most interesting collection that we came across, and that's of a woman named Hannah Huntington. So, and during this process, being perfectly honest, we've struggled to find documents, letters, stories from female settlers, from children, and especially from Native people in Ohio, their experiences. So when we found a large collection of letters from one woman who actually lived in the reserve in the early period of settlement, it was pretty wonderful for us and for this project. So Hannah's letters run a period of 20 years. So they start when she's in Connecticut. She's in Norwich. They start with her courtship with her husband, actually. Then they go through to when she moves to the reserve, and they finish about the War of 1812. So it's a good period of 20 years, and it gives us the whole story of her getting there, settling, and what life was like early in the reserve. So Hannah marries her distant cousin, whose name is Samuel Huntington. I will say, trying to do the Huntington genealogy was quite challenging. They all have the same names, but this is a portrait of her husband, Samuel Huntington. And he was raised in the home of his uncle, who was also his namesake, another Samuel Huntington, who was the governor of Connecticut. So he's raised in a pretty prominent household, marries Hannah. And what you see immediately in her letters is that even before they go to the reserve, Hannah and Samuel are separated quite a bit. So most of her letters begin with something like, I wish you were here, a general summary of how the family is, lamenting at his absence, things like that. And that occurs even when they're still in Connecticut, because Samuel is quite an active businessman and a politician. He's quite often in New Haven and Hartford. And through Hannah's letters, we sort of understood that he's not always successful in his business. So that might be one of the reasons they will leave the reserve. But I love this letter only because at the bottom, there's a line, and it might be somewhat sarcastically saying something like, I'm sorry to complain so much in my letters to you, but I'm a woman and all I can write about is our domestic matters, which at the time, would make sense at the time. But if you read Hannah's other letters, you'll find out this is actually pretty far from the truth. Hannah was quite a remarkable woman in her involvement in the family's finances, his business, and just her knowledge of what was happening. So this is another letter moving a little bit forward. And this is her pretty much saying to Samuel that she's heard that he's going to get into business with a man named Jackson B, who we unfortunately don't know, but that she's heard from other sources that he's the kind of man who is unprincipled and will, do anything to make a dollar for himself. And she's saying, don't, be careful, and don't go into business with him. And then on the right is another one she's heard of. She's pretty plugged into what's happening in the politics and General Assembly, and she's heard of. And again, it's hard to piece together all the information because she doesn't give names or dates a lot. But there's going to be some sort of lottery, and she hopes that Samuel secured a profit for them. So she's very aware of what he's doing in Hartford, in the capital, and sort of unafraid to sort of give her opinions and her ideas as well. The bottom of that letter, so she finishes by saying, I hope you will not leave me this winter for a Western expedition. So this is when Hannah's aware that Samuel's sort of looking west, and there's the chance that the family's going to be uprooted. So in the beginning, obviously, she expresses apprehension. Right around this time, she gives birth to their sixth child. So they have a newborn when Samuel's looking west and deciding if they're going to go west. And then actually in July of 1800, Samuel does leave Connecticut, goes to Ohio, and his whole purpose is to see if they can live there and where they would live. So in July of 1800, Hannah seems, pretty accepting that they're going to eventually move to Ohio. And she says, I hope you'll find a little spot that you will like and have everything in readiness for my removal next summer. So she's accepted that the family is moving to Ohio. She also asked Samuel to have a log house put up during the fall so that when they arrive, they have a place to stay. Log houses were pretty common as the first place that someone would live. And then after time, they might move on to a larger house and eventually a stone house. So Samuel does return to Connecticut. He brings his family on to Ohio. They travel in a group of 18 people. So you get a sense of how large, if they could, they would travel with others. It made the journey easier. So there's the Huntingtons, so Samuel and Hannah, their 6 children. And then they also have, somewhat different from other experiences. They bring a male servant named George, I believe, and a young female servant named Patty that accompany them. And Hannah, interestingly, also travels with a woman named Margaret Cobb. And Margaret is, in some places, she's referred to as a governess, but there's no actual evidence that she was a teacher or a governess for the children. What we do see in her letters is that Margaret was a very close companion of Hannah, a very close friend. And understanding that Hannah's often alone, it's really important for her to have someone in her life besides her children, and that will be Margaret, as we'll see going forward. The first letter that we see from the reserve is dated October 9th, 1801. So by that time, they're settled. Samuel's already off doing his own thing, and Hannah's running the household and the farm. But just thinking about how people got to Ohio, I wanted to put this up. This is a great graphic that shows some of the two popular routes about getting from Connecticut to the Western Reserve. There's the northern route, obviously, that goes up through New York, along the river and down, and then the southern route that goes through Pennsylvania. Each route offered different advantages depending on the time of year. The northern route, if it was cold enough and the lakes were frozen, you could actually use a sleigh and get your goods moved that way. Depending on the time of year, you could also use different waterways. The dashed line is more accurate to what the surveyors took on their way out as well. So you can get a sense of how they went. Hannah and Samuel and their group go down through Pennsylvania, so they opt for that route. And generally, you could do, I think it's 12 to 15 miles a day if the weather was with you. And understanding it's 400 to 500 miles away, depending on how far where you're going. That's quite a distance. And it usually took about a month for a single traveler on horseback. So when Samuel went, he would have been able to do it in about a month, but 2 months for families traveling with more possessions, or more if you strike bad weather. I think the Huntingtons stopped somewhere in Pennsylvania for a short time during their journey as well. So once they're in Ohio, Samuel is quickly, he accepted a number of positions. He served as a militia officer, road supervisor, justice of the peace, a senator eventually, Supreme Court justice, and ultimately the governor of Ohio. So he's a very busy man, off doing things, and the capital, or wherever the capital was at the time, is not where they're living. So he's quite often removed from the family. And this kept Hannah and the children and their household quite separate. So this is, the most powerful, sad letter that we came across. And sickness is an extremely common thing that Hannah writes about. All people from the Western Reserve write about sickness at some time. And you can see here that she was sick, and that their child was the next victim of it, and that eventually the child died from that sickness. This is the child that was born just before they left. He's about 4 years old at this time. But what strikes you about this letter is the fact that she doesn't use the child's name. She doesn't say Samuel. She uses the word it. And that she wrote this letter almost a month after it happened. So there's obviously, we don't want to read too much into the letter, but there's a lot of things to unpack from that. But then she ends it, and you can understand this, sort of complaining about the station that they found themselves in life, where they live and how things are. And she says, I don't want you to be tied to my apron strings. I don't want you to give up your career, but there's no reason being a governor or, wherever, whatever he was at the time. There's no point having your offices if it means that we can't live together and we live in this state of society. So she's obviously at this time, and you can understand it, not happy in the reserve, as many people were not, and looking for a change. But then, so not all the letters were sort of that nature. There's some that are, actually quite happy, or small happinesses that she found. I love this letter, and there's two parts to it, so you can see it. The first part, she's talking about someone not letting them move their cattle through his territory. And I love the line she says, I have a small faculty at scolding, and I've taken the liberty to use it. So she's obviously she's pretty much head of the household while Samuel's gone, and she's having to make business dealings, financial decisions, all on her own. And she seems pretty comfortable doing it. And then there's the second part talks about a man named Mr. Kingsbury, who seems to be a adversary of this family. And he said that Samuel was not going to keep his estate together a great time, that he was unfit for his office, and that he called Hannah to her face a proud, squandering woman and not half good enough for you. But I love that Hannah's response to that was that, I'm sorry it makes him upset, but at least it affords Margaret and me some mirth. So she's taken this in stride, which is actually pretty amazing. This letter was pretty great. Then there's other ones. So this one's again related to business. So this is one where someone's come for the taxes, and Hannah's hoping that Samuel can pay it. The part at the bottom is interesting. She says, if I pay it, I'll put myself out of cash. We know that in the reserve, for some reason, cash was really hard to come by. Investors also struggled to find cash. Families struggled to find cash. A lot of the transactions were through bartering or through goods or some other method. But she says, I don't want you to think that it's my fault that I don't have cash. I'm not wasteful or spending my money foolishly. But this again shows that not all of this was, Hannah has hard times in the reserve as well. So she was forced to make hard decisions. And then the one on the right, she's saying that she's happy to inform that the wheat is in very good order, and that it's been remarkably wet, so they can't get the corn in. But at the bottom, she says, my neighbors told me that it would answer very well indeed, and there are some that have not begun to pick corn. So this is sort of a way for Hannah to say our crops are in for the winter and we're going to survive, but also we're in better shape than other people. And if you read enough of these, you sort of get a sense that this is a way of Hannah saying, expressing pride in her ability to run the farm, which is remarkable and something that you see going through. Even in later letters, especially after the family moves from the Cleveland area to outside of Cleveland, she writes full out. She says, she openly expresses pride at her neighbors, thinking of her as an excellent manager of the farm. So what we're seeing in the Western Reserve, partially through necessity, but also through opportunity, is Hannah's really, people like Hannah are changing gender roles in the reserve and taking on new responsibilities that they wouldn't have had in Connecticut, which is what makes some of her letters really remarkable. And this is another example. So this one, she's working with someone who's supposed to come dig a well. And because they haven't lived up to the contract term, she tells them that the contract can't be done and she sends them away. So again, this is a decision that she wouldn't have been making were her husband home, but now she's in the position to make it. And then here is, she's deciding about the children's schooling. So she's saying that they're going to stay instead of being sent away. It seemed like she did a little bit of homeschooling. You can see the little boys I've schooled myself, but she's too busy to continue to do that. So she's making plans for their schooling. And eventually they would be sent away to a private school in Ohio once it gets started. And then the very last collection that we looked at while we were there, and these are the last sort of people we'll meet in Ohio. This is the last one I looked at physically the day before I left. It was the last hour while I was at this repository, and I came across a whole stack of letters from three men, Ephraim Kirby, Uriel Holmes, and Elijah Wadsworth. And what makes this interesting to us is that these are all Litchfield residents. These are all names that we know well. They're represented in our collection, and we know they were involved, but it was sort of remarkable to find them writing to each other all this time. So Ephraim Kirby is a veteran. He's practiced law in Litchfield, and he's credited with compiling the first volume of law reports published in the United States. Uriel Holmes attended the Litchfield Law School, so he's one of our law school people. And he established his legal practice here, and he eventually became a state senator and a U.S. representative. So he's, pretty well connected. And then Elijah Wadsworth served during the Revolution in Benjamin Talmadge's unit. And he's the only one of these three men who actually lived in Ohio. So he's the connection point with the reserve. And then you can see the last bit of all their titles. They're all land speculators. So they're all involved in the company. I think Holmes and Kirby are, proprietors, and then Wadsworth comes on as a surety. So he's sort of financially backing the two of them. On the right is just one of the few land advertisements that we found that's talking specifically naming the Western Reserve. So you get a sense of what that looks like, all the different tracts that are for sale. So this is one of the first letters. So this is the first letter that Holmes writes to Wadsworth on the left there. This is after Wadsworth has gotten to Ohio, and Holmes says, "We wish you happiness and prosperity in the new world." Interesting language. He's talking about people who might be interested in lands in Ohio. But on the bottom, you say, "Mr. Wolcott and Mr. Skinner have written to you, as I understand. You must not be afraid to contract for Talmadge at the same price as we agree." So this is indicating that Holmes and Kirby, who are still here in Litchfield, are soliciting their neighbors, their other friends, to get involved in this business. This is how men like the Wolcott family, Benjamin Talmadge, become involved in investing in the lands in the Western Reserve. On the right is an advertisement that Holmes placed in it. This is actually a newspaper in Pennsylvania, so you get a sense of how far afield he was looking for settlers. And there's a few telling things in this document. The first being that he's advertising the sale he says it on the top right, that for actual settlers only, and he italicizes that to emphasize it. So Kirby, Holmes, a number of these investors are sort of getting uneasy at the fact that they can't actually get people to settle in Ohio. They can sell the lands to other investors, but they really are encouraging people to go out, live there, improve the townships, because all of that would help them continue to sell land and increase the value of land. He also says the title isn't unquestionable, which I question because we've talked about the legality of the Western Reserve and where these lands are, and the fact that they changed hands legally so many times, that one of the major concerns was of people going out there was, if I buy land, is it even my land? Who will protect me? Who will govern me? And he's trying to say, don't worry, your title's unquestionable. I have it. I'll pass it on to you. He says that his lands are quality, and that the situation are as good as any other. So why should you buy from Holmes, not someone else? And then he lays out at the bottom, he lays out the terms of the sale. So there's a document, there's a whole lot in here that tells us about what's going on and what the investors are doing. So this is Ephraim Kirby. This is the first letter from Kirby to Wadsworth. And this is actually related to things here in Connecticut. So the state of Connecticut that Wadsworth has left behind. And you can, if you read it, you see the Federalists are amazingly violent in this state. And Kirby is saying that he's had to prosecute several of them for slandering him. And what this sort of leads us into is thinking about why people left Connecticut or why people went to Ohio. And we break them up into two things. So push factors are things that would actually make you look outside of Connecticut. Pull factors are what brought people into Ohio. And one of the ones, as Kirby talked about, you can see it up there, is political pressure. So the fact that the Federalists are in Connecticut and they're often seen as a standing order, but they're facing a challenge from the Democratic or Jeffersonian Republicans. But some sources have said that if you were not a Federalist in Connecticut, you faced either migration or imprisonment. So that gives you a sense, that's exaggerated, but it gives you a sense of how much pressure these people are feeling and that they might look to somewhere like Ohio to relieve that pressure. The biggest one and the most simple one is just the population versus how much land is available here. So the population in Connecticut had got to a point where there was little available land left and even less resources. And the big one they talk about is timber for fuel and for building. So as Connecticut was, the timber was cut down and people had less access to land, they really needed to look elsewhere. So agricultural yields has to do with some weather events that happen around this time that produce particularly poor harvest seasons here in Connecticut. And the last one is religious pressure. And this has to do with the fact that up until 1818, Connecticut, when the Connecticut adopted a new state constitution, the Congregational Church was established in the state, and they were sort of the religious entity that was really involved in all of your life. And if you didn't want to have so much religion in your life, you would again look elsewhere. And Ohio offered a place where it was far more of a voluntary aspect of your life in the early years. And then the pull factors. So why are people looking to Ohio? Again, these are sort of, they answer the push factors. So there's more available land. There's the promise of agricultural potential. And one of our big things in this exhibit has been to tell people that there's the expectation of Ohio and the reality of Ohio, and those didn't always coexist. So someone like Holmes is going to tell you his land is fabulous. When you get out there, you can find that it's a swamp. So that's why I said promise of agricultural potential. Employment opportunities. So we do know that people in Connecticut who might have been, for example, someone who was a carpenter or a cabinet maker could go to Ohio and become an architect and a house builder. So there is opportunity for upward movement if you had the right skills. There's also, again, the lack of old New England institutions. Old New England institutions probably referring to political and political parties in the church. And then the presence of family or support networks. So this becomes increasingly important as settlement moves forward. If you have someone in Ohio who's your relative, who you know, who's your friend, who can give you some sense of support, some sense of society, that would help you make that decision as well. But people in Connecticut are obviously not blind to the fact that there is this big outmigration. This is Oliver Wolcott Jr., who was the governor, and in 1817, he says this quote, he says, an investigation of the causes which produced the numerous emigrations of our industrious and enterprising young men is by far the most important subject which can engage our attention. So he thinks this is a huge problem, that people are, some of the people who are most enterprising and industrious are leaving Connecticut to find opportunities elsewhere. He doesn't specifically say the Western Reserve, but that would have been one of the top places they were going. So this is Wadsworth writing to Kirby. So the good thing about this collection too is it's not just one set of correspondence, is not just incoming, there's also outgoing, which is great for us. But you can, again, right at the top, money is scarce in this country. So no one in the reserve can get cash for some reason, be it, just the fact that currency at this time was less stable or that people aren't bringing it, but everyone needs cash and no one can get it. And then he's also talking about how politics, both in Connecticut, in Ohio, on a national and a foreign level, are influencing their ability to sell lands in the reserve and promote settlement. So you'll see this group of men especially are concerned with the idea of war threatening it. This being relations with Great Britain, France, and Spain. If you think about the map in about 1800, they're all the powers that are on the edge of the American frontier. So obviously war with any one of them would impact the ability to get people to go to Ohio. And then at the bottom, he's talking about the difference between politics in Ohio and Connecticut as he perceives them, that the people in Ohio were pretty satisfied with the present administration, and they do not thank our old friends in Connecticut for their exertions for it. So again, it's great that Wadsworth is in Ohio, and you see that you're seeing people writing from two locations, and you understand the differences between the two places. So this is Ephraim Kirby writing again. Again, it's following the same thing. The Federalists have cried out for war and opposed every Pacific. Spelling is always not great on these measure of the government. And he's actually talking about the Louisiana Purchase in this letter. So he's talking about the purchase of all that land you can see around the orange border to the left and down into Louisiana, that was purchased from France, and that if they had listened to the Federalists who wanted to go to war, they wouldn't have been able to gain this, or they would have done so, expending millions of money, disturbing and breaking up the settlement of new countries, and they might never have obtained it. So again, it's just interesting to follow the political thoughts of this group of men. And then this is Holmes, and Uriel Holmes is definitely the most anxious of this group, this partnership, this group of men, to actually get people to go to Ohio and promote the land sales there. And he's right on point, because the reality is that there's relatively little migration to the Western Reserve until the War of 1812. By 1800, I think there's only about 1,000 people in the whole Western Reserve. So in that period where they've been promoting it, not to remove from this letter, there's very few people that are actually going. And there are a number of factors that add into that. There's the fact that there is a financial downturn, political uncertainty. There's also the fact that the way the Connecticut Land Company doled out the plots for the investors was completely random. So if you invested in the land company, you could have lands spread throughout the whole reserve, quite a far away from one another, and then you sold those to other people who wanted to move there. And the end result is that settlement is really scattered. It's not concentrated. It doesn't start in any one place that grows into a township and promotes settlement elsewhere, which is why there are only 1,000 people spread across the whole place. And Walt Woodward, who writes things as well as better than I can, described this sense of settlement as the cabin in the clearing, not the inviting village, was the most common sight in the region for many years. So again, settlement is dispersed. And that really prevents people from wanting to go out there. And then here's another quote. So he's saying in this one that he wants to sell all of his lands in the town of Litchfield in Ohio, named for Litchfield, Connecticut. And what he's trying to do is get Wadsworth to take a more active role in promoting the sale of lands when he comes back to Connecticut, or can't you write us a good account of the country so that we can put it in newspapers and heighten the spirit. And this is Holmes who did publish that advertisement saying that things were great in Ohio. So again, this just gives a sense of the urgency felt by some of the investors and the difficulties that they faced in trying to get the reserve to be settled. And this is actually a letter from Kirby. So Ephraim Kirby is named commissioner and judge in the Mississippi Territory. So after the Louisiana Purchase is made, Jefferson sends him into the Mississippi Territory to hold a number of positions. And he writes Wadsworth about his traveling southwest. And he says, there were a number of times where our group almost lost our lives. So obviously travel is dangerous. He's traveling on the waterways, and there are a number of times where he thinks he's not going to make it to Mississippi. We do know that he made it to Mississippi. And the unfortunate thing is that very shortly, less than 6 months after he gets there, he dies. He contracts what we believe is yellow fever, and he dies in 1804. So the next letter that Wadsworth gets is not from Kirby, but from another man named Seth Beers, who writes, "You've undoubtedly received the intelligence of the death of Colonel Kirby." This is the letter here, this actual letter that we found. The sad part about Kirby too is that Jefferson had written a letter to Ephraim Kirby, not knowing he had died, naming him governor of the Mississippi Territory. So, Kirby was quite good at his job and really well thought of, but, and he thought he was going to die on the way to Mississippi, but he ultimately died of illness in Mississippi. And for the other two men, So, there we go. So Wadsworth is actually appointed as a major general in Ohio. So he actually leads the militia in Ohio for a period of a number of years. And then during the War of 1812, he actually raises further militia. He builds fortifications, and he's really responsible for defending Ohio during that war. He funds all of that through his own finances. It's actually that sort of ends at the end of his life. He's in really financial straits from actually paying for the defense of Ohio. Holmes continues to practice law here in Connecticut, but he also, like Kirby, dies fairly young, actually from a carriage accident. So he's injured in a carriage accident and doesn't recover. So it's interesting to sort of trace these three men from Litchfield in their early careers through the business in Ohio, and then seeing sort of how their lives took shape. They all, other than Wadsworth, who gained some notoriety in the war, they all have fairly tragic ends to their lives. And I believe that is all that I had today to sort of stay on time. So that's such a small amount of the story that we're going to tell. One of the biggest struggles when we do these lectures is to try to condense it and give you an idea of what the reserve was, what life was like. But these narratives took you through to about the War of 1812, which is sort of one of the periods where we're sort of ending our observation. We go a little bit past to about 1830, because when the Erie Canal comes in, it means a lot of things for Ohio. But this is the period we're really focusing on. What was the actual experience like leaving Connecticut, going to Ohio, and how did the people who experienced it tell those stories? So that's what we wanted to find in Ohio. And I hope that gives you a sort of sense of this history. And I will say, if you are interested in learning more, April 21st, our exhibit will open, and we actually have 2 years of programs planned. So the exhibit will stay up all the way for 2 years, and throughout the whole time, topics that we can't get to in the exhibit or in programs like this, we'll have other lectures, and you can stay in touch. We'll obviously be sending those out. So if there are any questions, yep.
Yeah, I missed the beginning because I was at
Yep.
the registration desk, but I'm thinking you're talking about the same time period of this Western Reserve as the Lewis and Clark Corps of Discovery.
Yep.
Same. So what was going on out west, which I always thought of being a later period of discovery,
Yep.
was contemporaneous with the Western Reserve.
Yeah, with
push from New England, the original Atlantic states was going on up here in what we would call the Northeast and out in the new Mississippi territory.
Yeah, so the Western Reserve, the way we sort of talk about it is that Ohio is sort of the testing ground for ideas about westward expansion. So the government is using it as a place to talk about how new land should be surveyed, how they should be sold, and they're sort of trying it out in Ohio. But Ohio gets established in 1803 as a state. Settlement continues for a long time after that, but it doesn't stop there. It keeps going west. So Ohio is just one part of westward expansion. It's the one that we have the most direct connections to due to the nature of the Western Reserve. But it is, yeah, so by the time that Hannah's still finding her way in the Western Reserve, Lewis and Clark are already on their expedition. So it just continues. And this is just one part of that story. And what we hope to do in the exhibit is contextualize it a little bit. Obviously, we can't talk about the whole history of westward expansion, but this is sort of a microcosm, a little test subject that we can focus on.
What is that?
This is actually a picture from, I think, the 1830s to 1840s of Cleveland, outside of Cleveland, looking into the city. Yeah, so from the log cabins that Hannah is describing, you can see there are, wood frame structures. There are even stone structures. I love this image because you can see the courthouse and the Congregational Church. So some of those old New England institutions did find their way out in town planning and how they built it. But one thing we're having to find, since we're planning a very visual thing, an exhibition, and we have mostly words, is how do we, visually tell the story, which is why we love maps. We're using as many objects as we can, and also images like this that just give you a sense of what it might look like. Yep.
Is the College of Case Western Reserve in Connecticut's Western Reserve?
Yes, yeah, it is. It is in Cleveland. It's actually on that campus where the repository we went to, the Western Reserve Historical Society, has rebranded as the Cleveland History Center, but they are the institution that collected the history of the reserve, and they're on that campus. And it was a gentleman from Connecticut, I think from Goshen, who went to the town of Hudson and was responsible for starting to found that institution. So that's one of the few instances where the name Western Reserve has stuck around and people know of it, is Case Western. Yep.
Can you talk a little bit about slavery or the slave people in this process?
Yeah, so
That's one question. And the second question is about the Native Americans that were there.
Yep.
Were there any remnant? Were there any wars that?
yeah, first of all, so the story of Ohio being admitted to the Union ties into the idea of states with slavery and free states. Ohio's constitution forbade slavery in the state. So there wasn't the institution of slavery as we know it. It's probably likely that some settlers, that there would have been enslaved individuals coming into Ohio before the Constitution during that early period. But in the Western Reserve, especially, and this is something we want to continue researching, the Western Reserve became sort of a hotbed of abolition activity, especially at Case Western and some other places. So it's directly tied to that story of, you know, what states will be admitted that allow slavery, and Ohio in theory didn't. We have found evidence that after that constitution, they did enact laws that made it hard for free Black migrants to come and settle in Ohio. They definitely went out of their way to still make it difficult. You had to do something like, if you wanted to settle, you need to get a certain amount of money raised as surety. You needed to get letters of introduction. So all these impediments to, Black migration were definitely there. In terms of the Native Americans that were there was obviously conflict. I mean, all of the treaties that I showed were based on conflicts occurring in Ohio, Michigan, that area. I don't believe there are any federally recognized tribes that have their base in Ohio now. So all the tribes that were in Ohio were obviously forced to relocate elsewhere. And we find the tribes that have connections are now in places like Indiana, Illinois, elsewhere. But that's not to say they're not active in telling Ohio's history today. And one of the things we're continuing to do is try to find representatives who will sort of work with us for the 2 years we're doing this project to tell more of those stories. Because that is the hardest thing to find, is first-person accounts from Ohio's Native people about their experience. We find a lot of them in the Library of Congress, so letters sent from tribes to people like the presidents and people that would be kept in the Library of Congress collection, their founders collection. But in terms of just an experience of like someone coming across the Surveyor and what they felt about that, we haven't found that yet, and that's one of the things we hope to continue to work on. Yep.
What would the Indians accept as payment for the land and these treaties that they were giving away?
So there was cash, goods. They had things like they had continued to have hunting rights on the land. So it's sort of a mix of things, and each treaty had a different amount of things spelled out. But again, the treaties are being signed with certain representatives from certain tribes that aren't empowered by their tribes to negotiate that ceding of that land. So whatever they're being given is not, obviously not being accepted by the tribe as a whole, in with the cost being the land that they had traditionally lived on and hunted on. And I do know that, multiple letters to people like Thomas Jefferson and later presidents from the tribal representatives are saying that those promised payments are not even being delivered as initially agreed. So yeah, obviously the treaty. We say treaty, I almost want to say, with quotation marks, because it's not a fair treaty. It's one side taking what they want and the other side, having no choice but to accept it. Yep.
Of the original 13 colonies, did they all have their equivalent of Connecticut Western Reserve?
So if we go back to that map, they all have, I think 7 of them have land claims that they could have a similar situation as the Western Reserve. I do know that they're even within Ohio. Let me find it because it does answer this. It's all the way in the beginning. So one of these tracks you can see is called the Virginia Military District. Another one involves Michigan. So even within Ohio, there are other states that are trying to get in the game of getting land. I haven't seen a single instance, or I don't know of a single instance where one region was settled by people from one place and kept that identity as long as the Western Reserve did. I think that's what makes the Western Reserve unique, is that there was this direct connection and it really retained that original New England, Connecticut identity for a long time. And it continues today. Not so much we learned in Connecticut, but in Ohio, people are aware of that connection and they know a little bit more about the Western Reserve than we typically do. But in terms of like another direct correlation and the same sort of thing playing out, I haven't seen one. But there might be some. So we do have our first lecture is going to be by a geographer who is helping us. He's on our committee. And he looks specifically at movement of individuals and the creation of regional identity. So if you were wondering if there was other instances, he'd be the one to ask. And that's the week after we open, if anyone wants to come.
On that map, all of the states go all the way to the Mississippi.
Yeah.
So they're,
Yeah, so certain states, like Pennsylvania, New Jersey, certain states didn't have, by their charters, didn't have the same land claims, and that was the point of contention. Was a big state like Virginia, if they had that much land, there would never be, equality in how the nation was governed, and that was why some other states put up fights. But obviously, they all eventually ceded this land, with the exception of the Western Reserve. But then the government did do things like they sold lands as well. So even if the state wasn't claiming the land, they could buy tracts of land from the government as the Western lands opened. But this is the only time we've seen this concept visually expressed is in this one map. And I just love it because you get it. You just take Connecticut and push it all the way west, and somewhere in there you'll hit the reserve. And that's what we're talking about.
On that point, was Connecticut, like the other states, were they easy to get to agree to give up the lands to federal control? What kind of,
Yeah.
is that a piece of your story?
Yeah, in terms of,
Was it a hot conflict?
we haven't looked too much at like when all the states, individual states ceded lands and some of the discussions around that or difficulty put up. They all did it at different times. So obviously some of them took longer. Where we do know there's a lot of contention is even once they've ceded lands and figuring out where state borders are. So even before, and this is, again, we could spend a whole day talking about this story, but even before Connecticut went to the reserve, they tried to settle Pennsylvania and New York. With again, this land claim that's theirs by the charter. And there were actual armed conflicts called the Pennamite Wars that resulted. So there's a whole another story about, and even, if you read the charter, some of the eastern border of Connecticut is all the way into Rhode Island. So even in the charter, it's still overlapping with other colonial charters. So there's a lot of discrepancies. But in terms of figuring out what was going on internally in each state and their state governments about whether it was the right thing to do to cede the land, we haven't really looked into that, but that would be a good project for, moving forward.